on behalf of Faculty of Medicine and at King Abdulaziz University, we would like to welcome you all to the workshop led by the Prince الأمير مقرن bin Abdالعزيز for the scientific chair of dealing with disaster and emergency preparedness for the university. On my behalf and the Faculty of Medicine, I'd like to welcome all the speakers, coming from all over, from the States, from Norway, from everywhere. Actually, I would like to start presenting our first speaker, who's Dr. Carl Taylor. He's an executive director from Fraser Institute for Health and Risk Analytics. He's also a former director of the NCDMR and the CEO of CDAR Global. He's going to talk about, in his first presentation, first lecture, which is going to take about 50 minutes, of the principles of health risk preparedness, the strength and the weaknesses of hazard, vulnerability analysis, and surge capacity management. What we're going to do for the next 1.5 hours or almost 2 hours, we will start by having 50 minutes presentation, then 10 minutes discussion, and then we will have 10 minutes break, and then another 50 minutes presentation followed by 10 minutes discussion. And by that, we will close our workshop. So I would like to introduce Dr. Taylor, please.
Good morning, and thank you very much. What I want to accomplish first is to talk about hazard vulnerability assessment, and we'll talk about this in the context of physicians, hospitals, and healthcare providers. Hazard vulnerability assessments really is that moment in time when you ask, what is it we're worried about? What do we need to be concerned about as part of the continuum of care in delivering healthcare during disasters? Then we'll take a short break and come back, and then I'm going to deal very specifically with what's called surge capacity. It's that moment in time when you have to do more for more because the things that you worried about in our hazard vulnerability assessment have in fact occurred. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the challenges of those so that when you're in the active practice of medicine or you're leading hospitals or healthcare facilities, perhaps this morning will allow you to become better prepared. At least I certainly hope so. So let's see if we can start. Please do not hesitate to interrupt me if you have questions. We will save 10 minutes at the end of each of the presentations for comments. It's fine if your experience is different. It's certainly okay to say, I disagree. It's certainly okay to say, absolutely, I've never heard anything better. However, but that's not likely. So let's see if we can start. The easiest place to start with hazard vulnerability assessments is really to talk about what's a hazard? What's a hazard anyway? A hazard is that man-made or naturally occurring event that somehow imperils your ability to deliver care, that imperils your ability to see patients, that imperils perhaps the hospital or health facility that you're working in to actually remain open or to remain functional. And remember, this is a disaster conference, so we're talking about those moments in time when you're called into play to become a healer of those who have been injured or ill because of an event. I will say this probably more than once this morning. The one common denominator of all disasters or all events or all outbreaks, no matter how caused, whether they are naturally occurring or man-made, the one common denominator is the need to provide care for those who have been ill or injured as a result of the event. There is no more important part of disaster response than talking about the medical implications that come from that. Now, to be fair, I spent 10 years, actually spent 12 years in academic medicine, 10 years in disaster academic medicine, So I will admit my bias, but I'm right. Well, at least I'm right in believing at least that, that medicine is really what is most needed and has to be most involved in disaster preparedness, because it is what comes out of any event is healthcare. So let's begin with hazards. There are four that when you sit down in your committees you need to talk about. There are four kinds of hazards that you need to worry about. The first are internal hazards. Those are things, if you're working in a hospital setting, those are things that only impact that hospital. That could be a fire at that hospital. It could be a flood at that hospital. It could be a cyber attack, which is certainly more recent these days, a cyber attack, but it's something that has impacted your hospital facility so that when you're delivering care, you're not able to deliver care, at least not in the same manner that you've historically delivered care, because something has happened inside that facility. The next impacting event are external events. Your ability to practice medicine is the same as it was before the event. Your hospital is still fine, but something has happened outside in the community. If you saw in the paper last week, there was an attack on a university in Garissa, Kenya. And you'll see that about 150 students were killed. I know Garissa very well because it was one of the first sites of one of our projects of using the ability to export knowledge to the physicians at the hospital in Garissa. It's sort of what happens in Kenya, as a quick aside, is that young doctors in Kenya, when they graduate and get through residency and training, are often sent to rural hospitals. Garissa in the northern part of Kenya is one of those. And so a young doctor, a wonderful friend of mine, Teddy Mwimi, was sent as a young doctor to the hospital in Garissa. And Teddy reached out to me and he said, I'm struggling because we're starting to see victims of violence in Somalia coming across the border. And my training simply hasn't really quite fully prepared me for this. Can you help? Can you match me up with others who've had more experience in treating victims of violence? And so when I saw Garissa impacted last week, that's an example of a mass casualty event that has happened outside of your care, outside of your facility, but suddenly is going to send lots of patients to you and to your facility for care under very rapid, extreme circumstances. Very compressed in time, very significant injuries, combination of injuries and deaths, and they're all going to come to you to provide care. And so one of the things that you want to think about as a physician, or if you're part of hospital leadership, is how would we provide care rapidly? And we'll talk a lot about this later this morning. How would we provide care rapidly if an event like that occurred and we were on the front lines? The third kind of event to have to worry about is really an internal, external event. That is often a natural disaster that impacts everyone. I work and live on the Gulf Coast of the United States and now on the Atlantic coast in Florida, but for 10 years on the Gulf Coast. So when a hurricane hit, and in the second part of this lecture this morning, we'll talk some about Katrina, which was a very good example of an external, internal event, because Katrina created this huge footprint over the Gulf Coast area of the southern part of the United States, not only impacting lots of residents who needed care, but actually impacting a lot of the hospitals as well. Anyone been to New Orleans? Anyone been to New Orleans in the U.S.? So you know that in New Orleans, when Katrina hit, the largest hospital there, called Big Charity, of course closed. Many of the other hospitals did. In fact, in New Orleans, only three hospitals were able to stay open during Katrina. So external, internal events are events, perhaps sandstorms, perhaps flooding as you had a few years ago, are events that impact your ability to deliver care, but they've actually also impacted your community's ability to assist you in delivering that care as well. And so you'll want to consider those. The fourth order of business, or fourth consideration, of hazard vulnerabilities is one we don't talk a lot about. And that's really what I'll call the local global events. For example, Ebola is not a native concern here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is, for the most part, a West African problem. However, an Ebola victim on an airplane, in fact, can take Ebola with them anywhere. And so one of the things that you will want to consider in hazards and vulnerabilities is what might be happening outside of our geographic boundaries of the kingdom that might actually put an impact on us. And it might be in a number of places, as we were talking about last night at dinner, it might be refugees coming across the border. Not something you thought about initially, but all of a sudden refugees fleeing fighting coming across the border will have requirements for health care. It certainly might be, as Dallas Presbyterian Hospital found out, an Ebola victim that found their way to their hospital, and in fact, they didn't recognize it as Ebola, sent them home, and then the patient came back and later died in the hospital. But if you'd asked Dallas Presbyterian before, were you prepared for an Ebola patient? If they answered truthfully, the answer is probably no. We've done a lot of highly infectious disease planning, but in fact, until you actually experience a highly infectious patient in your healthcare facility, you don't really realize just how much goes into having to be prepared, in many cases because of the human dynamic of dealing with highly infectious patients. I always say it's much easier to respond after a sandstorm or a flood or a hurricane or a tornado, because then you're dealing with events in the past that have led to healthcare needs of the present and the future. With highly infectious outbreaks, even coronaviruses, which of course you have experience with, those outbreaks not only have impacted the patients, their family, and community, but also impact the hospital and the workers as well. So it's a key part for you to consider on your hazards. So then if that's a hazard, what is a vulnerability? A vulnerability is then your fragility, your exposure, your concerns of that particular hazard. If then we're going to look at that, what could bring about a vulnerability? What could bring about an exposure? What could bring about a risk or a threat of that hazard? Well, sometimes, to be fair, it's poor planning. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the second part of this first lecture, about why I think hazard vulnerability assessments miss their mark quite frequently. But sometimes we just didn't think about it. We didn't imagine it. We didn't think this kind of event would ever occur here, and I'll come back to that in a few slides. Sometimes, however, it's just geography. You are, as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, you are geographically, well, in part, you're surrounded by water. And so if there are events from the water, which could be tsunamis or storms or hurricanes or events that are waterborne, well, you're a kingdom surrounded in part by water. It could be events of your neighbors. If you're in an area in which your neighbors are in crisis, as is happening in Yemen today, it could be simply, well, we are here as a appropriately constituted infrastructure, but we are the strongest, best infrastructure in the region, and so people will look to us for leadership in delivering care or trying to respond. So sometimes geography is, well, it can be your friend, and perhaps sometimes it can create challenges. The third vulnerability is really, well, it's not so much a vulnerability that you create, but it's a vulnerability that is created for you. In the United States, for example, we chose certain hospitals to be Ebola receiving facilities. Here, I know last year you chose certain hospitals in the kingdom to be MERS coronavirus receiving facilities. So that is a vulnerability that you must prepare for, not necessarily because of something you did internally, but because the government has made a wise and rational decision to make sure that there is expertise in dealing with certain injuries or illnesses in certain hospitals, because expertise will enhance the ability of an acceptable outcome. And so decisions made by others which impact you can constitute a vulnerability, regardless of where that comes from. The goal today is really fairly straightforward. And that is we want to reduce or avoid losses. I'm going to expand this goal before we get through this morning, but we would prefer not to have losses. We would prefer to be able to deliver safe, effective care to the victims who come to us. The second part of this morning's lecture on surge capacity management will be the challenges and the burdens and the struggles of delivering effective medical care to victims who come to you. But our goal as healthcare providers is to provide safe, effective, compassionate care to those who have become ill or injured by reason of an outbreak. Oh, by the way, as we'll talk a little bit later this morning, our goal is also to remember that we have other patients now as well. Your oncology patients are oncology patients today before an event occurs. They are going to be oncology patients tomorrow, even if you've had a major event. So the patients that you have today, that you're touching today, the patients on dialysis today, will be patients that need dialysis tomorrow, even though events may have pushed a great deal more victims to you to have to manage. And we'll talk about that in the second part of the lecture of how we balance the healthcare needs of today with all of a sudden having to respond to disasters and emergencies. And then if your facility is impacted, and if you're not able to render care, can we get back up and running quickly? And again, as we'll see from the second part of the lecture this morning, sometimes that answer is yes, and sometimes that answer is, well, no, unfortunately not, for a number of reasons. In the United States today, most healthcare facilities use, and forgive me, this is a very blurry, difficult slide. If you have an interest in it, I can give you a link to this, but most healthcare facilities in the United States today use a form called a hazard vulnerability analysis. Anybody had any experience with this form? Okay, good. So if you're familiar with it, and in the United States, it's the two sources are Kaiser and the American College of Hospital Engineers. And the hazard vulnerability analysis form is meant to, well, it's really meant to structure your thinking. It's a list of what could go wrong with a list of questions about how bad and how difficult it might be, then running out alongside of what could go wrong. I'm going to be not critical, but I'm going to supplement my thoughts about the hazard vulnerability assessment. So don't take it as criticism, but there's some strengths and some weaknesses, and we're going to talk about both of those if you'll permit me in my time on this part of the talk this morning. But the form then it's a moment in time, and hopefully perhaps in all of your careers, you'll be asked to participate in this process because it's very important to get clinical advice as well. Because at the end of the day, I always say buildings do not provide health care. Physicians provide health care. Buildings are simply one of those places where health care might be provided, but it's the physicians that actually have to lay hands on the patients and provide that level of care. And unfortunately, in the United States, quite often physicians are not invited into the vulnerability process because we're thinking about the buildings, but in fact, again, buildings don't provide care. The vulnerability process is best done early in what's called the disaster cycle. And this slide is sort of that process. And the reason that you want to do it early is because if you don't know what you're worried about, it's very difficult to develop a plan and exercises in order to test your readiness. And so the vulnerability assessment process is something that's done quite early. One of the things it then does is it actually takes your concerns and your vulnerability and puts it into a numeric value. And if you think about it, the reason for this numeric value is, in theory, it is to, well, it's to make you aware of what you ought to be worried about first. What is it we are most fragile from, and how should we spend our time on that? And I'm going to talk about that a bit as well. When done well, each of you in your careers will be asked a series of questions. One is, what's the probability of this event impacting us? I urge caution on how you answer that question, and I'm going to tell you why in a couple of slides. The second is, well, if we think we have a risk, how bad might it be? Magnitude is defined as well, how bad do we think something could impact us? If you live in the deep south, you never worry about snowstorms. So if we think we might have an isolated ice storm, we never think it's going to be very bad until you realize southerners can't drive in ice of any kind. And so a little ice or a little snow actually impacts us more than if it's in the northern part of the United States. But magnitude is, how bad do we think an event might be? And again, I urge caution about this, and I'm going to tell you why in a couple of slides. The next is, well, if we think that there's a problem and we think it might be an issue, are we exposed to it? A typical example is if we know that there are storms on the ocean, but we're well inland. We can agree that there's a storm. We can agree it might be a bad storm, but we can agree that we're far enough inland or high enough on a mountain in which that event is not going to impact us. So even if an earthquake drives a tsunami, if we're on the side of the mountain, we're going to feel comforted. I'm going to slightly debate that in a couple of slides as well. And then finally, if we know the event, we know preparedness, and we know exposure, are we ready? Are we ready and are we prepared to be able to actually respond? And so the math behind this is really sort of the risk of a hazard plus its severity minus what? Well, minus your preparedness, your mitigation. What have you done to try and minimize risk of loss? So when it's well used, when a hazard vulnerability assessment is well used, when you're asked to participate in an assessment, it's a moment in time for a dialogue. It's a moment in time for a discussion. It's a moment in time to talk about, what do you think we ought to worry about? What do you think we ought to be concerned about? And if so, then do we need to highlight our planning opportunities in order to be prepared to be able to respond? And if so, then one of the ways to be able to test your plans, and again, I urge some caution in this, but one of the ways to be able to test your plans is to actually try an exercise. How many of you have been involved in an exercise as part of your planning? Yes. So there are a number of different exercises, as you know. One is called a tabletop exercise. You do those. And tabletop is really a scenario planning event. My only sometimes concern about tabletops, they're very easy to do. We could do one here this morning together. We could do a tabletop exercise. My only challenge sometimes in tabletops is everything always works. You ever noticed in a tabletop, most of the time, everything works, the power stays on, the computers work, our communication works, we're able to reach people that we're able to reach. And so, but tabletops are a good way to get started. And then you can try and do functional exercises, you can move forward, but practice is often a good idea as a way to advance your understanding of the hazards and vulnerabilities, including tabletops. If nothing else, what vulnerability assessments ought to do is, well, they ought to encourage a dialogue. They ought to encourage a discussion. They ought to encourage collaboration. In the United States, frequently they do not, mostly because there's a very small team involved in doing the vulnerability assessment. I am a big believer in broadening the number of people around the table so that you get more input into what is it we're worried about and how well do you think we could respond. Because at the end of the day, the real goal of this dialogue is, can we be effective in our response? And so here's what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to move beyond the chart or the form that we saw 3 or 4 slides ago. Hazard vulnerability assessments. Now this is, I will confess, this is my opinion. I am wrong occasionally. Actually, my wife will tell me that I'm wrong often. And she's generally right. But my opinion is hazard vulnerability assessments are very good for the known. They're very good in recognizing the needs for those events which you have experienced. How many of you here, for example, have been involved in or had experience with a sandstorm? Show of hands? Sandstorms? Yeah, right? So I would trust you in sandstorm planning because it's something you've had experience with. If you ever want to know about hurricanes, ask me. I've had more experience with hurricanes than I could possibly imagine. And so, again, what happens is that you wind up with the things that we know, the things that we're comfortable with, the things that we've experienced and that we've responded to. We're very good at preparing hazard vulnerability assessments because experience has been our teacher. And that's a good thing, with only one exception in the United States. I don't know about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But in the United States, the one exception to things that we've had that we never are prepared for are teenagers. I don't know if that works here or not, but in the United States it does. But otherwise, it's something that we're familiar with. However, and this is very important as you move through your careers, where I believe hazard vulnerability assessments leave room for improvement, or room for dialogue, or room for concern, are the things that we have not experienced before. And I'll give you an example. The picture on the left-hand side is actually a meteor that's coming down to Earth. Now, I don't know about you, but I have not had experience with having to deal with a meteor or asteroid disaster. I'm just not. But 2 weeks ago, I was at a conference, and the conference was really divided into a couple of parts. One was talking about Ebola, and I was on a panel with some Center for Disease Control people, and we were talking about Ebola. But the presenter before me was from NASA, and that's our aerospace administration. And his presentation was on near-Earth misses of asteroids. And it was a fascinating discussion about a future impact that could impact us when an asteroid hits either someplace on land or someplace in the water. If it hits the water, it creates this huge giant tidal wave. If it hits the land, it's not so good for hitting the land either. The sort of current debate is that NASA would rather have the asteroid hit land. That sounds good unless you're the land where it's going to hit. But one of the issues is in the hazard vulnerability assessment, you're not going to be asked about asteroids, or for that matter, and I'll talk about this in a minute, falling satellites, because that's not one of the choices we have experience with. Likewise, the other concern about vulnerability assessments is what I call cascade events. Cascade events. And cascade events, if we were talking about it from a human health perspective, human health, obesity drives hypertension. Hypertension drives heart disease, right? So they cascade. So poor exercise, poor diet, maybe sometimes poor genes drives hypertension. Hypertension can drive a heart risk event. In disasters, as we saw in Japan, an earthquake could create a tsunami, which created a nuclear power plant meltdown. That is a classic example of a cascade event. Hazard vulnerability assessments do not deal with cascades very effectively. In fact, mostly what they do is they ask you to evaluate and to assign numeric value to siloed events as if events happen in a vacuum. As if a hurricane is only going to be a hurricane. As if a tsunami is only going to be a tsunami. As if a nuclear event is only going to be a nuclear event, when in fact they can be combined, and all of a sudden you find yourself having to deal with multiple types of casualties. Think about this if you were one of the doctors in Japan a few years ago, where you would be dealing with the trauma events from the tsunami at the same time that you would be dealing with radiation burns from the power plant. You have to think about combined events as you're preparing. And in surge capacity management, we're going to talk a little bit about that. But my answer is, if you ever doubt that we are missing opportunities, think about how many times you may have seen or heard or read the phrase, "We just never imagined it would happen here. We just never thought it would occur here. No one ever anticipated that this would happen." If you don't recognize the picture up there, that's a black swan. It comes from a book by Nicholas Taleb by the same title. And his position was that no one in Europe knew that there were black swans. Everybody thought that, the only kind of swans that were swans were white swans, until somebody went to Australia and suddenly saw a black swan and went, "Oh, we never imagined." The most common phrase, remember at the beginning of my talk, I said that hazard vulnerability assessments are a moment in time for imagination. They're a moment in time to think about what could happen in Jeddah. What could happen in the kingdom? What is it that we should most be thinking about? And let me just add to this, because it's critically important. What is it we should be thinking about that we have not thought about before? Or have not thought about it in combination before that could produce a surge of casualties that we would have to respond to, so that when it occurs, and if I leave nothing else with you on this part of my talk, my goal always is, if you are involved in hazard vulnerability assessment, if you're involved in disaster planning, and if unfortunately an event occurs, that your answer is not, we never thought about that. We never imagined that. But rather the answer is yes, we anticipated that would happen, and we're doing the best we can to respond. That's really the goal that I think we take with us. Now here's the challenges then with the vulnerability. First of all, I think it's very difficult to reduce disasters to just an ordinal number, to just a number. Is there more or less of a risk of a serious hurricane? It doesn't matter. You should always plan for the most severe event that could occur, rather than saying, well, there's only this is a 3, but this is a 5. Well, no, the fact is each and every year, each event in your life has a chance of occurring. We were talking earlier, and I'm going to bring an unfortunate story in just briefly, but it's a story about cancer. And my first wife died of metastatic melanoma, and I know your dean is an oncologist, which is wonderful. It's such an honored profession. But if you were to ask us before suddenly it happened, if you ask us if we anticipated that, the answer would have been no. My wife was incredibly healthy. She was a runner. She used sunscreen. She did everything, and all of a sudden, she developed cancer. You can't. What were the odds of her getting cancer? Well, in her case, it was 100% odds. But if you had asked the day before she was diagnosed, we would have said virtually nothing. No cancer in the family. Incredibly healthy lifestyle. Her risks would have been near zero until it was 100%. And you need to think the same way about the disasters, particularly when you're imagining what could happen. And you need to overcome what I call the 4 M's that are barriers to us being effective in thinking about the medical management of disasters. And I'm going to draw from a story of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Anybody remember that? Read it? I had to work that, so I'm going to talk to you about it from my perspective. We know about British Petroleum's hazard vulnerability assessment before the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon. We know about it because they had to publish it. It was a public document. So the first rule of thumb that occurred was what I call the creation of the myth. And the myth was that while we're drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, nothing bad can ever happen. Nothing bad could ever happen. Now, interestingly enough, I would argue that BP themselves knew that wasn't exactly correct. Because in the Helios building in Houston, Texas, they run a lot of simulation programs. And they knew that the people who were drilling the oil wells were aging, that there was a gap between the young people coming in, and so they knew that on occasion, bad things happen to oil wells when you're drilling, including in the Gulf of Mexico, but the myth was nothing bad could ever happen. Nothing bad could ever happen here. Nothing bad could ever happen here because, well, we're Jeddah. We're in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Nothing bad could ever happen here. We're well prepared. That's sometimes a myth. The second is a motive. Why would BP create that myth? Well, there was a very clear motive, and that was they wanted a permit to drill the well. If I tell you as a regulator nothing bad can happen, then my motive is, will you give me my permit to drill? And of course, that's what happened. So they got a permit to be able to drill the Deepwater Horizon. Why? Because nothing bad could ever happen. The next myth is, and this is very, very important, and I encourage you to keep it with you in your planning, is it's okay if anything happens, it won't be all that bad. Maybe it will just be one or two cases. Maybe it will just be one small fatality. Maybe it will just be a few displaced refugees. Maybe it will be something that, well, it's really not that bad. What BP basically said was, well, even if there was a little oil released, it would just be a few gallons. Just a little drum, just a little something. Yes, maybe there'll be a little burp someplace. So we reduce the magnitude. In part, I think it's human nature to things that we think we can control. And as you'll see in the second part of my presentation this morning, I'm going to show you some pictures of things that we didn't control, that sometimes you can't control, that sometimes the forces of weather patterns and nature simply overcome the things that we think we can control, and Katrina was a good example of that, but there have been others. And I'm going to share those with you in the second part of this presentation. But we underscore, we underplay the magnitude of events. Why? Because then we say we can manage those. If I've underplayed the magnitude of what could go wrong, then clearly my plans and my tabletop exercise show I can manage it. It must work. It must be okay. It must be all right. But in order to do that, your imagination has to be stifled at exactly the moment in time when you should be the most creative, the most worried, the most concerned, the most articulate about your problems. But in fact, when you minimize the magnitude and you maximize the management, you suddenly have created this moment in time when your imagination has gone away. And there are times when your imagination has gone away that it can become very threatening. In Hancock County, Mississippi, anybody been to Mississippi? Anybody? Well, that probably applies to most Americans too. Hancock County, Mississippi sat on the Gulf of Mexico, body of water much like the Red Sea. The Hancock County Emergency Management Agency, it was that organization responsible for the planning and the hazards and the vulnerability and assessments and the response in case an event occurs. In the United States, under our structure, the emergency management agencies are those that are responsible for emergency management. They're the ones that do the hazard vulnerability assessment. And so the EMA in Hancock County Medical Center put their offices and the center of all of their hurricane management response in a building 1 mile from the Gulf of Mexico. Why 1 mile from the Gulf of Mexico? Because no tidal surge had ever come a mile inland. And because their imagination was stifled, they did not recognize nor anticipate nor prepare for Hurricane Katrina. And when the 35-foot wall of water hit their emergency management building, those who were in the building began a series of events. The first thing they did was they wrote their social security numbers on their arm. In the United States, Social Security numbers are like a personal identifier. It's a number that is only mine. Of course, now we've been so hacked with cyber threats, it's now mine and probably several thousand people in the world. But, but it's my number. And so the emergency management people, the very people responsible for imagination, the very people responsible for managing Katrina, were writing their Social Security numbers on their arm. Anybody want to tell me why? Exactly. Exactly. Did everybody hear this response? Because after they're dead, it's the way to identify them. The second thing they did was they started writing notes to their loved ones. Everything that you've always wanted to say to a loved one, and now at that moment in time as the waters are rising, they're writing notes to their loved ones, and they're putting them in plastic bags, and they're putting them up in the rafters in the ceiling of the emergency management. And then they shot a videotape. And the videotape, again, was meant to be that moment where these emergency managers said goodbye to their families. And the videotape begins with this line: "We who were supposed to be the rescuers now need rescuing." That was a failure of imagination. We fail to imagine because we have silos of knowledge. We're much more comfortable dealing with things that we know. Or we're much more comfortable simply creating a vulnerability analysis and then putting it on the shelf someplace. We're much more comfortable putting something in paper and putting it up and then believing that we don't have to touch it for another year, even though we know events change daily. We know the region around us changes daily. We know that the turmoil that is often in this part of the world will evolve on a daily basis. And yet we put our vulnerability analysis on the shelf and say, oh, we've done that one. We fail to imagine, and what I call we miss the 12th annex problem. And the 12th annex problem is a very interesting short story. Some good friends of mine who were in charge of the medical disaster preparedness for the United States, for the federal government, were asked by the White House if they were fully prepared for any event possible. And in fact, came back the reply, yes. We are fully prepared for any kind of disaster that could befall this country. We're ready. We have a disaster plan with 11 chapters in it, and it covers every kind of disaster, man-made or naturally occurring, that can create healthcare harm in our country. We are ready, said the White House. That's good, because we have a satellite falling out of orbit from space, and it's likely to hit Houston. Came the response back, we're not prepared for that. Or my favorite line, we need a 12th annex. That's what happens, right? That's that moment in time when you say, what are we actually worried about, and how do we do that? So, I think that the challenge is, can we? Can you? It's not me. Can you anticipate events before they occur? Can we change from always simply responding to events after they occur to thinking about them beforehand? Can we be more proactive in the way that we are, what I'll call, leaning forward into events? And I believe that answer is we can, with a few just criteria. I have the hardest time with my old team of simply saying, can we admit now, can we agree now, that the way that we do hazard vulnerability assessments, and I have taught hazard vulnerability assessments to over 10,000 healthcare professionals. And only over the last 2 or 3 years have I suddenly come to grips by saying, I think I've not really done a good job. I don't think I've really said what ought to be said. I think I've spent way too much time on the form and not enough on the outcome. And so really only in the last couple of years have I started to push forward. And the biggest challenge is, Can we agree that the form is a place to start but not a place to end, that there are things out there that we're missing? Can we develop something different? My challenge to you on this topic is, can we do something different? And I think you can. I think that one of the things I say is that we can actually get to a place where hazard vulnerability assessments become living processes, that there's a path to what I call recognition of emergent risk. Now, what it requires us to do is to reach out more broadly into our communities and ask them what they're worried about. I'm going to, if I remember to say it Thursday when I'm talking about infectious diseases on Thursday at the conference, I'm going to talk about that the first indicator of a burden of disease may not be the patients that you're coming in contact with in the hospitals, but it may be sick animals, it may be a high absentee rate in schools, it may be illness among airline workers, it may be, in fact, other indices in the public that could alert you to events before patients actually begin showing up in the hospital. Can we, in fact, lean forward into our communities? I would suggest, by the way, as a quick aside, that this is equally important from a healthcare perspective. You know, in the United States, I have a phrase I use a lot, and it may not make sense here, so forgive me if it misses. But I always say that 95% of all healthcare in the United States takes place in the home. Only 5% takes place in a physician's office or hospital. That's when things have really gotten out of control. If you really want to change the health habits of one of your patients, you've got to know what their habits are during the day. I have a little app now on my phone, and it counts the number of steps I take every day. And I'm now at a point where I come to the end of my day, I don't want to disappoint my phone. You know, all of a sudden now it's, have I walked enough? Have I taken enough steps to be healthy? Well, I would say the same thing about vulnerability assessments. Have we reached out into our communities and have we acquired information that helps us become aware of the things that we should worry about? And there's some easy ways to do this. This happens to be something that we created a couple of years ago, and it's a collaboration hub. And you know, at one level the answer is, can we just look at some of the RSS feeds? Can we just look at information that's coming out? The United Nations does something in Indonesia now where they collect millions of cash register receipts, and they're just looking at changes in buying patterns to see if that indicates a change in health behavior of residents in Indonesia. Likewise, can I create an easy way to ask my community, what's happening in the community that we should be worried about? What is going on? How could we have known about Garissa before Garissa occurred? Could we have sort of asked our community and gotten their sense? Could we have asked our community at the university level and determined whether the level of security, Kenya is very security conscious. Could we have asked whether or not the level of security at that university was adequate, not by the 6 guards that were killed, but by the students that attended there? Could we have asked and could we brought them into our dialogue? Could we also use crowdsourcing? You know, it's interesting, I landed, this is my first time in your country, and thank you very much for having me. And I noticed, and I'm grateful, I actually am really grateful to be here, and I noticed so many commonalities. There's very much in common between us. And one of the commonalities is our smartphones. I'd argue one of our commonalities is traffic in malls. You know, but one of our commonalities is a smartphone. We have an ability to communicate. So can we actually use this common denominator to be able to share information with each other? In addition, and you probably are already doing this here at your medical school, but one of the most effective things that we did, and it's a little bit past the tabletop exercises that we talked about earlier, I'm a big believer in visualization. So let me explain this model up there. We took all of the medical data of a large population in one state in the United States, and then we calculated what would happen if that population over time came down with a highly infectious disease. Now, I want to set the backdrop for this just briefly, and I want to be mindful of time because I want to leave time in this part of the talk for discussion. But one of the things that happened was when we were talking to hospitals and said, if we had an outbreak of avian influenza or coronavirus, are you prepared? Oh, yes, we're prepared. We're ready. We've been to your classes. Of course we're ready. Well, then we ran a model. And the model assumed this disease outbreak, and then it assigned hospitals in the model that these patients would be going to. And all of a sudden, as you see these bars and graphs come up, and you see the volume of patients over time coming in, and you suddenly realize that by day 9 of the outbreak, we're completely out of ventilators in our intensive care units. Then all of a sudden, our physicians start to take a step back and say, we're not ready. Now that we've seen, we're not ready. We thought we were. We thought we were. Everything was prepared. We've gone to courses. We thought we were ready. But now that we actually see, and we're able to calculate the needs of patients as they come to us against our supplies, we may have enough physicians, may have enough nurses, but we have a limit to the number of ventilators. We have a limit to the number of beds. Now that we see, we're not prepared at all. And that was really my goal of the model, is can we get to a point where we agree that preparation needs further imagination and further dialogue. So then what you wind up doing is I think, putting this ultimately into a structure in which the community feedback comes in and drives the model. So think about what I just showed you. So the collaboration information comes in, it drives a model that says, based on what the community is telling us, here's what could happen. And then from that, we design our plans and decision support, and I'll deal with that more if you join me on Thursday about how we do a better job then of making decisions from the models and the information. Why? Because our goals really are the same. We really want to mitigate. We want to stay open. We want to drive effective care. We want to be, for the very reason that you went to medical school, we want to be effective healers no matter what the circumstances are around us. Because the profession that you chose is a profession of healing. But in disasters and in outbreaks, those events will work against your effectiveness. And so the purposes of this is really to say, can we be prepared, including this is a picture from NASA of everything that might fall on us. Can we be prepared even when we need a 12th annex? And so what we're going to do is, I'm happy to field some questions. Then we're going to take a little short 10-minute break. And when you come back, we're actually going to talk about the challenges of being a healer in very difficult hazard-like conditions. So as we close this first one, I think we're almost on time. As we close the first part of this, are there any questions or comments?
Observations? Yes.
There is no imagination, and probably there is the maze, like a dry country, we don't have that. And we had a problem, like we had big flood a couple of years ago, and a lot of deaths we have, So what do you think, how to have the awareness of people to take it as a serious, to have really a good plan for disaster?
Yes, and actually it's a very good point. And let me talk about it from the community side just for a second. We've talked a lot this morning about healthcare. And I want to make a point, and I'll try and make it again as we get to the second part of this presentation. You cannot deliver healthcare, certainly not very effectively, unless the power is on. You cannot deliver care, at least not very effectively, unless you can communicate. You cannot deliver care, at least not very effectively, unless your supply chain and logistics are actually working. So if I'm on this side of the room and I'm a physician, I need to spend a great deal of time with you because I need to make sure that you actually have a plan in which the power will stay on, in which my ability to get supplies, because I'm going to consume supplies during disaster far faster than I do during normal, regular operating conditions. Why? Because you have more patients, and in many cases more community. We'll talk about this. But in fact, I need you, I need the city, to be very well prepared because I cannot deliver care in a vacuum. You rely on the providers to deliver that care, but I've got to look to you to say, are the roads open so the ambulances can run? You know, how do I get my drugs and my supplies to my hospital if the street lights aren't working? You know, if the power is down. And so there's such a synergy. So there's a real need, a key crucial need for the city to be well prepared and well planned. I would say the same thing about security, right? You know, because you need to manage security, you need to manage power, you need to manage communication, you need to manage transportation, you need to manage volunteers. And in many cases, those volunteers are civilian, non-medical volunteers because they're helping you carry supplies. They're helping you deliver water. They're helping you feed the community members who have come to you even though they don't need medical care. So their ability to do their job well depends on your planning and your ability and your imagination. So my suggestion, very respectfully, is, and this may not be appropriate, so again, this is day one for me in your kingdom. I am likely to make lots of mistakes, and forgive me. I just write it off as, you know, Americans, what do we know? The answer is really not very much, so just write that off. So, but what I would suggest is there's a real need for you to get together with you and talk about collectively how do we support each other. And I would always say, imagine bigger, right? The litmus test on whether or not what I leave with you has value or not won't be today. It'll be when an event occurs and your response is, we imagined that. We thought that might happen. We thought that might be, you know, something that could occur, and we planned for it. So you have to have a plan. You have to imagine. And again, I would bring lots of community members together. Lots of community members. You know, now there's a side benefit to it, just as a quick aside, is the more you bring community members in and the more you engage in the medical profession, interestingly enough, the more they will learn about the day-to-day healthcare needs of what's working in healthcare. Because one of the things that always happens during disasters, I'm back to this, right? Dialysis still needs to go on. Oncology care still needs to go on. My disease burden won't stop because there's been a bad storm. My disease burden won't stop because there's been an outbreak. My disease burden won't stop because refugees come across your border. It's very important and it's very critical. They and you get together and imagine and prepare and plan. Does that help? Thank you. Yes, sir.
How do you assess the awareness of such a risk before the event happens? What are the points that you look at before the event happens, and how do you see its efficiency and to pick up the weak points of preparedness?
Okay, that's a great question. Did everybody hear that? It was how do you prepare for events, and then how do you pick up the weak points of your planning? And so the first thing to do, I'm going to give you what I think is an easy but valid answer, and that is, if you expand the number of people in your planning process, ask those who have had experience with similar events before. Even if they're outside of the kingdom, ask others who have had experience with dealing with earthquakes, for example, or tsunamis, for example. I've always felt that there was a lot of experience. One of the worst things that we're doing right now, in my opinion, is there's so many lessons to be learned, both good and bad, on managing Ebola in West Africa, but we're not capturing those lessons. So one of the ways to start with planning is ask those who have been there before. So if you were dealing with, let's take a hurricane or a storm coming off the sea. I have a lot of experience with that. I can tell you the power almost always goes out. So we'd start with a vulnerability might be your generator. I can start with, in many cases, that the traditional sources of supply that you rely on may not work. And so start with looking at what keeps your facility running today. Now there's physical assets, power, light, communication, and then there are supply chain assets, right? It's who drives the truck up and offloads the food or the water or the medicines or the supplies. Which biomedical engineers come up to fix your PET scan or your MRIs or your CTs. What does it take? It's a very comprehensive discussion. It goes well beyond vulnerability assessments, but it's very important. What does it take to allow you to do your job today? What does it take? You'll find it's a lot more than you think. Then begin to imagine that those resources that we take for granted now don't exist. That something has happened, that our supply chain won't come in, that some of the workers that we think ought to be showing up at the hospital haven't been able to show up because they've been impacted, that some of the physicians weren't in, or some of our physicians or even our nurses were getting sick from the same illness. And begin to ask yourself, how would we manage if that occurred? And don't be afraid to have that dialogue. And interestingly enough, don't be afraid if the answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure. One of the biggest problems that we have, and I know that doesn't apply here, but one of the biggest problems that we have, and back to this, magnitude and management, two of my 4 M's is, of course we can manage. Of course we can manage. Now, to be honest, in difficult situations, I have a lot of faith in people. I'm going to tell a story in the second part of the morning about somebody that did something incredibly interesting. I thought it was the dumbest thing ever, and it turned out to be the smartest. I'm going to tell a story in the second part this morning. But don't be afraid to say, I'm not sure, I don't know. Because once you say, I'm not sure or I don't know, you empower the search for that answer. If this particular person doesn't come in to keep the x-ray running, or keep the MRI or the CAT scan running, what would I do next? What would I do next? Maybe I would cross-train others in the department. Maybe I would find someone in the community who would be willing to come in. Maybe I would find other people in the deep south, we sort of joke, which is I want to find somebody that owns a truck, right? That's our, or a tractor, because they're big tires and they work. And so don't be afraid to say, yes, what would happen if this supply chain were disrupted? What would you do? Well, I don't know. It's the perfect opportunity then to search for that answer. And test that search. Who is it I could reach out to? Who is it I could call? Who is it that would make me a priority that in fact would respond by bringing staff or supplies or resources to me? And that's, again, one of the challenges, I think, with tabletops, right? Because tabletops always work. You ever been a tabletop that failed and everybody said, boy, we're gone on that one, right? No, the power is on. The only time I've seen a tabletop fail, can I tell a huge story? I don't know if this we were doing a tornado tabletop at a hospital that was later impacted by a tornado. I have a picture of the hospital in the second part of this morning. And the lady who was their incident commander, we have a very structured response in the United States, went in to set up her command center. And they were having a retirement party for one of the doctors who was retiring after 30 years. And they said, you're not coming in here. And the tabletop failed because nobody wanted to interrupt the retirement party. That's the only time I've seen it. Tabletops always work. Everybody shows up. Everybody's smiling. Everybody has a good day. My cell phone always works on a tabletop. It just never works when an event actually occurs. It's okay to fail. Just fail during planning. Because that'll help you be successful when it actually occurs. That make sense? Does that help? A little? Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hazard vulnerability analysis are based on historical data.
Yes.
And it's used actually to categorize your hazard such that you can know what are the most vulnerable hazards to and direct your resources.
Yes.
So you know that emergency managers are really, the resources are their biggest challenge. If you would like to include the less vulnerable hazards or the imaginary events that will happen, how you are going to manage this dilemma between the resources and including those less occurring events?
Okay, so that's a great question too. And how do you, and so, I don't stay tethered very easily. This is very hard for me. So one of the issues is, you're right, you go through the hazard vulnerability assessment, it identifies the risks, you can match up resources and planning, and it fits into a box. But now we're talking about, well, wait a minute, what about something that's not on that list? There's a couple of keys to it that I think make sense. One is that in a concept of all hazards, there are certain common elements that it doesn't matter what the event is that you're going to need, right? There are certain resources that you're always going to need.
You're going to need power. Now, sometimes events will impact that power and sometimes they won't, but you know you're always going to need power. You're always going to need some way to communicate. Almost doesn't matter whether it's on that list of issues or others, but you're going to need some way to communicate. You're going to need some way to have a supply chain. It may not come from your resources, but you're going to need to have some way to have a supply chain. Now, what often happens, particularly with supply chains, is that you'll find in the healthcare side that you might be a priority, but you might not be the biggest priority. That there may be other places, right? Because particularly if you have a large-scale event, and you're trying to now take these resources and distribute them more broadly. But what that allows you to do as a facility is to say, okay, the resources that normally I would count on for these events may not be available to me for this. So can I find a backup source for those? Can I reach out into the community or reach out into my suppliers? Can I find something else? I'm back to this. My biggest concern about hazard vulnerability is not that it doesn't do everything that you said. It is that it makes us believe that that's all we have to worry about. The other thing that, and that's not true. And the second is that within the hazard vulnerability assessment, in many cases, because it ties into that disaster circle that I had, you're really planning as if the event is going to occur. What I would prefer us to do is to be able to get more information about our community and see events earlier. If you think about infectious outbreaks, right? Could we get additional information in, and can we see that event quicker? Could we respond faster? If I had a choice between a small problem or a big problem, I'd always rather have a small problem. You can do that either through reaching out or you can do it through mitigation, right? Stronger building codes. There's a wonderful picture in Haiti of the Digicel building that was still standing after the earthquake. Why? Because it was built to earthquake standards. Why did everything else fall down? It wasn't built to earthquake standards, right? So, but you're right. I think hazard vulnerability assessment is very valuable. And I don't mean to underestimate it, but I would encourage you to go beyond that. And in particular, to think about things that could occur. Just because they happen doesn't mean, just because they're on that list doesn't mean they could. And secondly, to think about things that cascade, right? If you have a tsunami, that's a very predictable list of medical things. But what happened with the tsunami? It drove a nuclear problem. That's a very unpredictable. Dealing with radiation injuries is something we don't have a lot of experience with. That's very difficult to do on that sheet, right? So, but HVAs are useful. They allow you to sort of look at resources. I always just, my fallback is always, great, these are resources I rely on, but what if they're not there? And I have some slides in the second part of this talk, and I'll show you where that ties in. Thank you very much for that question. Is a 10-minute break okay?
Yeah, I think it's time to have break for 10 minutes, and then we will come and proceed for this.
And we'll do surges. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Only 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue our workshop, and we will start the second half of the presentation. This time we will make it 45 minutes, and we will allow 15 minutes for discussion. So we would like to encourage everybody to get in from outside so that we will start. So I'd like to welcome again Dr. Professor Taylor for his excellent presentation, and we will continue for the second part. Thank you.
So in the first part of the presentation, we talked about imagining what could go wrong. For this part of the presentation, we're going to talk about when that imagination becomes reality. And we're going to talk about that moment in time when you have to do more for more, when you've got to deliver care under very difficult circumstances. What I often talk about is resource-constrained circumstances. And the title or the technical sort of definition of that we use is called surge capacity. And the definition of surge is you suddenly have far more patients coming in to see you than you normally have, and so your capacity for care during normal times is suddenly exceeded because now an event has promoted more and more patients, and in many cases community members, to come to you. I'm going to stick to the 45 minutes and leave time for questions, so I may slip through a couple of slides, but I want to make sure that at least we cover the principles first. And so surge capacity, as you probably deal with it here in the kingdom. I'm sorry, thank you very much. I'm barely trainable. Thank you. So surge capacity here, as I use it, is, again, it's the ability of your system to rapidly expand, to suddenly be able to deliver more care for more patients under very difficult circumstances. It might also be a moment in time for you to actually have to move patients out of your facility because your facility has been compromised, and all of a sudden you've got to find a way to move patients out and move them to other facilities, so you're actually surging out or evacuating. So let me use some very practical examples of surge capacity, and I think you'll begin to understand some of the challenges. This is a weather slide from April of 2011 in Alabama. It was a unique day because it was the most numbers of tornadoes with the highest intensity of any in recorded history in this part of the country. In fact, one of the tornadoes actually stayed on the ground mostly for over 180 miles, unheard of for most of the time when tornadoes kind of hit and take off and then move on. And so one of the hospitals impacted happened to be a hospital that I've done training for and response for. And it was called DCH Hospital. Now, this is a very interesting picture because the hospital was lucky in that it was still standing. But if you look at the picture and you see the damage and devastation, what you'll see is, and you can't really see it in the picture, but there's a parking deck. It's a 2-story parking deck that's just kind of under that debris. And if you stood on that parking deck and looked out, no further than from here to the back wall of this conference center, that's where the tornado damage is. Now, I don't know if you've had experience in a tornado before, but tornadoes are incredibly high winds, but they have a very defined pattern. It's almost like cutting grass. You can tell right where the grass has been cut, right where it hasn't been cut. And so literally you could be at DCH Hospital in the parking garage, looking from here to the back wall of the conference center, everything beyond you is destroyed. But your hospital is open. What DCH found out was that not only did they see a lot of patients who were injured by the debris, so you had a lot of orthopedic injuries, a lot of closed head trauma. In fact, the emergency management facility and the public health emergency management facility were destroyed by this tornado. So the usual infrastructure to help you during times of disaster was destroyed. But all the people were coming in. Well, DCH, for surge capacity, not only had a lot of closed head injuries and a lot of physical trauma to deal with, but because they were the nearest infrastructure open, over 800 people from the community came to the hospital, not because they were ill or injured, but because they wanted the hospital to clothe them, to feed them, and to give them shelter. And so one of the things that DCH realized was that they needed a plan not just providing care, but they needed a plan for helping in the community as well, because the community had come to them. We actually worked at another hospital not far from there as well, in which 3,000 members of the community basically showed up and said, there's no place else for us to go for food and water. You're open, you weren't injured, you weren't impacted by the storm. So all of a sudden they set up a feeding kitchen for 3,000. Well, the definition of surge capacity is this. A number of years ago, we set up an emergency ops center inside of a hospital during a hurricane coming over, and all of a sudden one of the things we realized is the hospital had actually not gotten enough food in. Had plenty of beds, had plenty of physicians, but when all of a sudden 3,000 community members show up, the hospital had not put in enough food to actually be able to do that which the community expected them to do. And so what we needed to do was quickly create a plan, not for delivering care, but actually for feeding the population. Conversely, of course, this was Joplin, Missouri, literally just a month later. 2011 was a terrible tornado season in the United States. This is Joplin. So just the opposite. In this case, the hospital was footprinted by the tornado and was destroyed. In fact, not only was the hospital destroyed, but they had moved all of their community ambulances onto the hospital grounds. They had moved their medical evacuation helicopters, you can see the one in the picture there, onto the hospital grounds, because there was this sort of almost mythical belief that the hospital would be okay, and that tornadoes somehow would respect hospitals and go around them in some way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, that didn't quite turn out to be the case, and of course this hospital was footprinted. All of their ambulances were destroyed, and all their medical evacuation equipment was destroyed. So now you have a hospital that has to evacuate all of its patients, but the means by which they would evacuate them We're all gone. And so what do you do? How do you create, it kind of gets back to the community side, right? What do you do when those things that we count on every day aren't there anymore, and we've got to create some workaround experience? This happens to be a photo from a fertilizer plant explosion. And again, what's unique about this is that it's a highly toxic chemical. That the fertilizer was highly toxic, so the patients coming to the hospital had to be decontaminated before they could be treated. So now you have a very different, this isn't closed head injury or closed head or trauma, the things that we can do orthopedically. But now what you've got to do is you've got to set up a decontamination facility in front of your hospital in order to decontaminate the patients before you can render care. There are some hospitals that do decon very, very effectively. There are many hospitals for whom decontamination is something they've never done, they've never experienced. And yet we know that events can create that need for them in terms of what they're doing. Boston Marathon explosion from 2013 at the end of the Boston Marathon race actually was a good example. I think Boston Marathon was a little unique because they have so many medical assets there at the finish line to care for the runners that when the explosion occurred, they actually had a very well-honed system, but they were dealing with a very confined event that happened to happen at a moment in time when there were lots of medical resources present. And so I think Boston, at the end of the day, most of the literature that's coming out now in the after-action reports would suggest they did a good job. Contrast that, unfortunately, with Katrina. Katrina was really two events. You know, we always refer to it as Hurricane Katrina. I had 5 feet of water in my house from Hurricane Katrina. But New Orleans had a flood. Katrina actually, interestingly enough, kind of skirted the city and really impacted Mississippi. We talked earlier about Hancock County Medical Center. It really footprinted the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and then a little bit in Alabama. But in fact, what happened, the very first newspaper article that came out after Katrina passed said, New Orleans dodges a bullet, meaning that the storm had passed, had been awful just to the east, but New Orleans had been okay. And then all of a sudden the dikes started leaking and the dikes gave way and New Orleans had a flood. Now consider this, only 3 hospitals stayed open in New Orleans, only 3. A lot of the population was still there. The population that was there were mostly those that were poor and unable to afford transport. I always said that for those people in New Orleans that owned a car, they got out before Katrina hit. For those that were living in public housing, for those that were service workers, for those that were poor, that didn't have the ability, they stayed. So now what was interesting is that Katrina, not only was Katrina 2 events, it was a hurricane and a flood. Katrina, from a healthcare perspective, was also 2 events. You had the events from the flood of those that were severely injured from the flood. But you also had a large number of patients that were normally relying on the charity care and the sort of social service hospitals, what we call safety net hospitals, that had been destroyed, that now simply needed care for their ongoing primary care. Huge burden of mental health that somebody had to respond to. It was very difficult to find the right way to respond. Huge burden of dialysis, very difficult to find dialysis centers in the middle of this picture. Huge burden of hypertension and diabetes, and very difficult. So you were trying to replace primary care at the same time that you were trying to do trauma care, and you were doing it in a highly compromised environment. So that even those companies which were good at supply chain logistics couldn't actually get in to the very hospitals that had stayed open that were still trying to deliver care. So you had a power problem, you had a communication problem, you had a logistics problem, but you had this huge primary care problem and a sudden trauma problem. Katrina was the example of everything. And we can talk a little bit more about that, or perhaps at a later time we'll spend more time, because I could stay here now until I leave Thursday night and just talk Katrina, because it was a unique experience. One of the other things from Katrina is not only did it footprint the hospitals, but it footprinted all of their senior care facilities in America. A lot of our elderly wind up in what are called nursing homes. The nursing homes flooded. So now you had elderly that were having to be shipped someplace. And of course, their preference is always to ship them to the hospital. Hospitals normally receive them, but not in this particular case with Katrina. Then there was Haiti. Haiti was another example of surge capacity where you had the short-term trauma injuries from the earthquakes. And again, that's something we could spend a lot longer on, but you had lots of people who had lots of orthopedic and trauma injuries in which the facilities themselves were unable to respond. So you had lots of responders coming from all over the world down to Haiti to provide care for earthquake-related trauma injuries. But they were not prepared to deal with the resource-constrained environments in which they were working. So you could show up and you could be ready to do surgery, except there was no anesthesia. There were no labs, there were no working x-rays. And so you were literally doing, you were doing care in the most unusual environments that did not in any way replicate the way that you are learning and delivering care here in Jeddah today, because there was literally no supplies. So you had doctors that had showed up, but they were having to do things under the most unusual of circumstances that required a lot of creativity. And of course, then Haiti had a second problem. In addition, well, actually really had three. It had the orthopedic and trauma injuries. It also had its displaced burden of primary care. I helped set up a primary care facility on the grounds of one of the medical schools, and we had 4,000 patients show up the moment we opened our doors, all seeking primary care. But then Haiti had a secondary problem, because then the rains came, and with the rains came cholera. And so now all of a sudden, on the back of all this trauma and displaced primary care, you now have cholera, and there's a number of reasons about how cholera got to Haiti. I think it would have come from a number of ways. Part of it was blaming part of the UN response, but cholera would have found its way to Haiti regardless. A lot of endemic disease burden in Haiti anyway, but now all of a sudden you're dealing with trauma, and you're dealing with primary care, and you're dealing with a cholera outbreak, all at the same time. And oh, by the way, Haiti has every other burden you could possibly have. Very, very, very complex tuberculosis, multi-strain drug-resistant tuberculosis in Haiti, huge HIV/AIDS burden in Haiti. You were dealing with the most complex health problems with the very, very, very fewest of medical resources. Oklahoma City bombing is a good example of what happens when you don't have a good plan for surge capacity. All of the victims of the federal building bombing all went to the very same hospital. And the hospital became overwhelmed because there wasn't a rational system of patient distribution. And then everybody looked back and said, but we were open. We could have seen patients. We could have taken them. If I leave nothing else with you this morning, it's the reason for regional preparedness and regional readiness so that you can be able to share patients and share resources. I'll show you a little bit about what that looks like if we get to it at the end of the presence. Korean ferry sinking. Anybody familiar with this, the Korean ferry sinking? So one of the issues with that was, of course, you had 400 and some people on the ferry, 300 of them died, but almost all of them were kids. It was really a school trip for a lot of kids. And so now what you have, and if you haven't experienced this before, you perhaps will at some time in your career, because now you're dealing with a large volume of pediatric patients. And an old friend of mine who's a pediatric emergency room doctor used to always say to me, Carl, children are not small adults. The dosing's different, the care is different, the way you have to deal with them are different. Let me also tell you, for another time, perhaps if we're together again, not only are you dealing with the children that survive this, but you're also dealing with the grieving parents. Because you're dealing with the grieving parents showing up at your hospital saying, where's my son or where's my daughter? And you're trying to decide at that moment in time because there's so little information, and now you're trying to define a plan for grieving parents. And I've always, in my experience, where you have a lot of pediatric ailments, the sudden trauma with kids, is not only do you have the parents, but you have all their friends. Because everybody that knew somebody, and this was a lot of high school kids, all of a sudden they flood to the hospital because they're looking for their friends as well. And they want to know how they're doing. And so there's this instant burden of how do we share difficult information. How do we maybe share your son or daughter is going to be okay with, how do we share, I'm very sorry they haven't found her yet, or they haven't found him yet, or I'm very sorry but they did find him but he didn't make it. And so you've got this, and I don't know if you saw the follow-up. The Korean government, is trying to create a settlement. And the parents, by the way, today, literally it was last week, the parents, usually enough, they don't want money. They don't want money. They want answers. They want to know how this happened. The ferry actually wasn't overloaded. They want to know how it happened. And so the parents have said the government's offering them about $383,000, I think, or something to kind of, accept it. And the parents have said, we don't want your money. I want to know why my son or daughter died. That's really what they want. And so there's this huge information need that parents and friends bring with them when you have a large loss. Again, Moore, Oklahoma is a good example where the local hospital was destroyed. And so the patients had to be transported across distances back to Oklahoma City. Rhode Island, we were talking on the break a little bit earlier. This was a nightclub fire. I had an opportunity to help in planning for a large event out in the West Coast a number of years ago. And one of the exercises that we ran was we assumed that there was an explosion that created a high percentage of burn victims. Now, I don't know what your ability at your hospital is to treat burn victims. I can tell you what we found is no hospital had enough dedicated burn units to really deal with a large event that had really impacted lots of people. Forget whether it's pediatric burns or adult burns, there's a confined limit to the number of very specialized beds that most hospitals have. And so if you're looking at the potential that an event might occur, the event we've imagined, which might occur, that creates lots of burn victims, then it's an opportunity for you. You have to reach across much broader resources. We literally, if you know the geography of the United States, the event was being held in San Diego. We had to create relationships with hospitals in Phoenix, Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada, in order to feel like that we had enough support for managing a surge of burn victims because of the unique things that are required. Now, I am now stepping onto dangerous ground because I'm talking about something you know very well, and that's sandstorms in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I can tell you our experience with wind-blown debris is the sandstorm itself may not necessarily cause a lot of injuries, but there's a secondary sort of spike in respiratory ailments. We see that all the time with tornadoes, and I've actually done a fair amount of research on this, that every time a tornado leaves, for the next 10 days, you're going to see this spike of patients presenting to the hospitals because they've been breathing in particulate that the tornado is blowing around. And so whatever that's done is it's triggered their respiratory ailments. And so they're going to come in with a very defined need. Now, what's interesting about this is, back to what we talked about this morning, right? You want to lean forward and anticipate events. So as you do your research and you do your studies on known events, you can then begin to predict with a lot of certainty the kinds of patients and over what period of time they will show up. So if I'm correct, and I may not be, but if I'm correct that sandstorms trigger respiratory ailments, then you know that when a sandstorm's coming, you can say that for this next period of time, anticipate these patients coming into the emergency room, and you can be prepared and lean forward. So you're actually leaning forward to respond to the disaster. You're not letting the events overtake you, but in fact, you're actually reaching out and you're being proactive. Same thing with coronaviruses. I'm so pleased with what we talked about earlier. What a splendid, wonderful job that you've done in managing coronaviruses. And again, it's such a unique thing that very few facilities have a lot of experience in dealing with highly infectious diseases. And to have a large hospital with a large number of patients and not have your staff also be impacted is such a tribute to you, such a tribute. And I can tell you that's a lesson that needs to be shared every place. At some point for another discussion, I can tell you where we're not as good at that in the U.S. by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, flooding. And as you know, flooding is a wonderful example of where it not only ultimately drives patients to you, but it impacts your ability to deliver care. Why? Again, supply chains are disrupted. Maybe your physicians can't come in. Maybe the power goes out. But surge capacity then is your ability to care for more who have more of a burden and needs, but in many cases with what? Less resources, less human resources, less staff, less supplies. And so when you plan for surge capacity, that's really what you're doing. And the reason why I think this talk is important for you, maybe it's because, again, of my own biases, but the common denominator of any disaster is going to be the need for the delivery of medical care. That any disaster, no matter how caused, will cause patients to find you and will need care, even though sometimes you're going to be challenged. So there's two sort of terms, and I won't dwell on these in the interest of time, but there's surge capacity. And that's really just how many patients overall can we actually safely deal with. The answer is a lot more than you think. The ability to actually manage patients in far greater numbers than you anticipate, with the right process and the right procedures in place, you can actually provide a lot more care than you think. However, there's a limiting factor to it, and that's called surge capability. And that's those patients that have unique needs that simply can't be treated outside on a tarmac or in a parking garage or in your receiving facility. And for those patients, burns are one, ventilator patients are one, highly infectious patients are another that you need to isolate from other members of your caring community. For those, you have more of a limit. And so it's important for you to not just deal with capacity of trauma events or displaced primary care, but it's also to say, are there certain kinds of cases that we're going to have a limit to, that we need to be mindful of that and create a plan. So now what we need to do also is be mindful that there's certain things that are going to change. I always say in the United States that under surge capacity, the standards of care are going to rapidly change. We work very, very hard in clinical medicine to set standards of care that are going to drive the outcomes that we expect. And so I'm going to give you an example. In New Orleans, you may or may not have remembered the press, but in New Orleans during one of the very early days post-Katrina, there was a police officer who was shot in the head. There was a lot of violence in New Orleans during Katrina. There was a police officer who was shot in the head, and he had a bullet in him, and he was transported to West Jefferson Medical Center. This is kind of one of two West Jeff stories I'm going to try and get to. He was transported to West Jefferson Medical Center, and in fact, they did surgery on the police officer, and the bullet was removed. Any trauma surgeons here? Anybody that does emergency medicine surgeons? I know we've got some emergency medicine guys. So the bullet was removed. I'd like to add a few other points to that story. There was no power in the operating room at West Jefferson Medical Center. So the neurosurgery to remove the bullet from the brain of the patient was done by flashlight. Or if you're a UK preference, by torchlight. Is that a standard of care? No, I don't think so.
You have a newer surgeon.
Oh, perfect. I'm talking to you. You're my friend. I'm talking to you. So it was done by torchlight, by flashlight. The temperature in the operating room was about 103 degrees because the power was off, the air conditioning wasn't working, the hospital had gotten very hot. And if you know what happens when you heat up a hospital, if you've lost your air, the walls actually begin to sweat. I mean, it's really interesting. You can't use things like X-ray or MRIs or CTs. It's a unique phenomenon. And so the temperature in the operating room is 103. They're doing the surgery by flashlight. And oh, by the way, during the middle of this surgery, only a sort of few hundred yards away, mobs have attacked a local mall and have set the mall on fire. And everybody in that operating room is thinking, can I get this over with and get out of here? Because we're afraid the hospital is going to be attacked next. And it's amazing to me, under no circumstance would you have done that surgery. In the dark, with no power, with an angry mob outside, almost under no circumstance. That certainly doesn't hit any standard of care. And so when I ask the folks at West Jefferson, why did you undertake that? Want to know the answer they gave me? Because there's no place else. There's no place else. When there's no place else, you will be successful. When there's no place else, you will excel. When there's no place else, you will rise above even what you think you are capable of doing. Why? Because it's the profession you chose. And it's what you're actually capable of doing. So at West Jefferson, why did you do that under these circumstances? Because there's no place else. And the police officer lived, and the surgery was a success. And it was absolutely grateful. And I just kept thinking, I am so glad at the outcome. Because if not, can you imagine the criticism that people would have given afterwards about how dare you do that surgery in the dark with the heat, with no support? So I'm so glad that he lived, but it was so interesting because there was no place else. It requires, as we talked about before, the entire community. Hospitals do not operate in a vacuum. You don't produce your own food. You don't produce your own petrol. You don't produce so much of the infrastructure. It's a community response. It also requires, I think, a very interesting sort of commitment. The very top plan, the very first sentence on your disaster plan ought to say, look, we really just have one principle, and that is we're going to maximize saving lives. Where I've extended this, however, is to make sure that that saving lives occurs not just for the new patients being brought in, but the fact that you have patients now. That you're saving lives today because it's what you do. But now if you have this sudden flux of patients coming in, you have those that you have with you already, and those that are coming in. And oh, by the way, you also have your staff to protect. Because if you're dealing with the coronavirus, one of your equal commitments is really to make sure that your staff stays safe. So yes, indeed, your responsibility is to maximize the numbers of lives saved, but it's a very broad definition of your doctors, of your providers, of your administration, of your patients, and your community. Now, not for today's talk, but perhaps for another time, I will leave you with a little discomfort before we go to the next slide. As each of you know who are in the clinical practice of medicine, saving lives under difficult conditions can be very hard. Very hard. One of the biggest challenges that we've had in training when you know that you have resource constraints is who do I care for and who do I leave behind? How many ventilators do you have at your, just as an example? Do you know how many ventilators you have? In the hospital?
Well, roughly the number is not very accurate, but I'm not sure. We have the number of ventilators. Actually, we have almost like in total 60 ICU beds with ventilators, and we have almost like 30 extra standby.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I'll use that hypothetical, and that's wonderful that you have standby ventilators because a lot of places don't. So if you have 60 and you have 30 standby, so we're at 90. When the 91st patient comes in, it also requires a ventilator. Then part of your planning will be, what do we do with that 91st patient? And there's really sort of two choices or three choices, isn't there? There's manage the patient by means other than a mechanical ventilator, certainly an option. There is transfer that patient someplace else that has ventilators. There is, well, maybe there's somebody on one of the ventilators that is not likely to make it. Do we make that decision? Do we make that clinical judgment of trying to change the ventilator usage to those that are most likely to survive? Do we have some that we're trying to rescue that perhaps aren't likely to occur? Are we comfortable with doing medical triage? And that's a very difficult thing in the United States. I don't know about here, but it's a very difficult thing because our physicians, that's not a comfortable topic. You know, paramedics or the military in the field kind of, doing that, that's what they're trained to do. But in American medicine, making that decision of who gets and who doesn't get is a very complex topic, and it runs into sort of medical ethics and creates all kinds of conundrums, which is why I always say, okay, how about non-mechanical ventilation is one of those answers, but can you make those decisions on who you're going to care for? And the reason for that and why it's important is that we always think about surge capacity as a sudden impacting event. But in fact, events can go on for a long period of time. You can have a lot of ongoing conditions, particularly from flooding, in which the events occurred as trauma, but now they've migrated into secondary illness, or maybe they've closed other hospitals. It took New Orleans years to recover medically from Katrina. And in many cases, I'd argue the city is not fully recovered even today, but it took them years to recover from Katrina. If you have a highly infectious outbreak, those can come in waves. You look at MERS, I almost think MERS is seasonal because it tends to spike, it seems like. Maybe it's not, but it seems to spike at certain times. So you're dealing with it, but you're dealing with it over a protracted period of time. It's not just something that's popped up and gone. If you look at avian influenza, there's all these patterns of influenza in which the likelihood of you being in surge conditions can go on for months as the virus works its way through your facility. We've talked about your other patients needing needs and scope of practice. I'll leave those. External events will matter. We talked about that this morning. The time of day when you're going through your planning, or perhaps even the month, might matter to you. Are there certain times in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia where you have more people in your kingdom than you do at other times? There are, yes. Yeah. Yes, I mean, pilgrimage is a great example of that. So there's certain times in which You could say, when I landed yesterday, there were a number of people doing the Umrah. So they were here, but that's a number. But if I were here in the fall, if I were here during the pilgrimage, that number grows. So now if you have a major event or a major outbreak or a major condition, then obviously that's going to create more strain. So one of the things that you'll want to think about in your planning is one of the reasons not to do a vulnerability analysis and just put it on the shelf. Because there will be changes that occur because there are events that are happening in your surrounding geographic areas that run the risk of creating more pressure on your facilities if an event occurs. Communication, I always say you've got to have a backup plan to communicate. We have communicated every way that I can think of. What happens when your cell phones don't work? How will you communicate? Do you have an analog that will communicate? Do you have a fax line that will communicate? Do you have a process of literally humans going in motion that will be able to communicate if in fact the cell towers go down? That's part of planning. Staff challenges. What happens if our staff can't come in? What happens if all of a sudden, we expect staff to come in to meet the patient needs, but it's their area that's been flooded. It's their transportation that's not running. It's their roads that are closed. How will we deal with a reduction in staff, and where will that staff come from? Well, it may come from others, but that's a problem in and of itself. I always say there's 3 kinds of volunteers you have to be prepared to live with, and that's those that you know from places you know. And those are volunteers that may come from other hospitals, other universities, other departments within the university. You know them, you know their capabilities. There may be some that you may not know the individual, but you know the organization that they're affiliated with. Maybe they're with one of the relief organizations, so it's okay. I know your organization, I don't know you, but come on in, I trust you. But then there are the third kind that become problematic, and that is, I don't know you at all, I don't know your organization, you just showed up and wanted to help. Well, do you or don't you take that help? That's a very interesting problem that requires planning and thought. Sometimes that answer might be yes, but sometimes that answer might be no, because it's more trouble to find out whether or not you're here for the right reasons or you actually here for the wrong reasons. Maybe you're looking because you want to see what's in our drug locker. Maybe you're here because you want to do things that are inappropriate with patients. Can we figure that out? So dealing with volunteers is very, very difficult. I always encourage you to deal with your supply chain. Every day hospitals require on vendors to show up and deliver supplies. What happens if they don't show up? What's our backup plan? And it's really not just supply chains within your immediate area. We've learned, particularly in the South and United States, that every time there's a hurricane that hits Puerto Rico, we have a drug shortage in the US because a number of the pharmaceutical manufacturing companies are in Puerto Rico. So the event may not have touched us, but it touched one of our suppliers. Very interesting, as a quick aside, we've had a huge strike or work slowdown, it's not technically a strike, on the west coast of the United States. So things that we would normally import from Asia have now been really bottlenecked. And so we know that there's been a supply chain problem. It's impacting Florida, even though it's something that's happening in California and Asia beyond. Transportation problems. What do we do if our ambulances are impacted or helicopters? Do we have alternative facilities? If we need to treat more patients and our facilities are full, can we convert this space? For example, could we take this auditorium as a place for grieving families? Could we use this as a place where grieving families could come and we could disseminate information back to them, because we'd rather have the grieving families here away from the hospital than clogging up the emergency rooms and getting in problems. How can we use other facilities that may be able to support this? I said I was going to tell a second West Jefferson story, and it's an unusual story, but I want to tell it. And that's about leadership. We always think about leadership in some hierarchical structure, and in fact, that is a definition of leadership. It's who we look to tell us what to do. In disasters, however, in my experience, some of the most interesting acts of leadership have come from people that I didn't necessarily recognize as leaders. And so I just have to tell you a quick story, because maybe someday it will matter to you if you're dealing with a disaster. It's day 3 of Katrina at West Jefferson Medical Center. And there are people from around the country that are donating supplies to the hospital. Some of the supplies are very helpful, some of the supplies not so helpful. That's for a later sort of funny story, but a lot of people up north have no idea how hot it is in the deep south in the summertime, so we got all kinds of sweaters that weren't very useful. But some of the supplies were very useful, but somebody donated to us a wedding dress. Now, I'm a disaster guy, right? A, I'm a guy, B, I'm a disaster guy. And so I looked at it and I said to myself, that's the stupidest donation I have ever seen in my life. Who in the world would donate a wedding dress to a hospital? I want to be blunt at that moment. I wanted big guys with big guns because I wanted to secure the facility from everything that was happening outside. I wanted guns. Somebody gave us a wedding dress. And I went, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And the HR director said, no, it's not. And so she took the wedding dress and she hung it in a common hallway so that wherever you walked, from sort of where the physicians were to the emergency room, you had to walk by that wedding dress. So I had to write a chapter for a book a short time after Katrina, and I went back and I started interviewing some of the employees at West Jefferson Hospital, and I said, okay, what really kept you in the hospital? What really kept you working? What kept you open? What allowed you to do so much under such difficult circumstances? And you know what I heard? The wedding dress. I said, what? You're kidding. He said, no, because the wedding dress gave us what? Hope. The wedding dress gave us hope. Because the wedding dress gave us hope that the sun was going to come out, that there would be weddings again, that there would be birthdays again, that there would be, that life would return to normal in New Orleans at some point in time in the future. And it was that view of the future that kept us here working in the present. So interestingly enough, a couple of years later, and Japan happens. And so, tsunami, earthquake triggers the tsunami triggers the nuclear fallout. And Japan was very interesting. The very first thing Japan said was, because as I popped up and I've got friends in Japan, and I said, what can we do to help? I have a lot of experience in this. I can be on a plane tomorrow. And they said, for heaven's sakes, don't bring us any American doctors. I said, what? Well, they had gotten so scared of the American response in Haiti because of all the amputations that there were actually these nightmares with the Japanese people that all of these sort of, amputation-happy doctors from America were going to flood Japan. And so the very first thing that the Japanese, legislators passed was no American doctors can come over here. So I said, okay, well, all right, so I can't organize anybody to come. What else can I do? And a good friend of mine ran a social blog, and he said, would you just write about your experiences? And so one of the things I wrote about was the wedding dress. And it was sort of a silly thing to do, but I wrote about it in this blog called The Social Company. And literally 2 weeks later, there was a young man and a young woman that got married in Tokyo. And they said, we're getting married because now is a time that somebody needs to have hope for Japan. And they had read the article and they decided to do it. And I thought, isn't that interesting? That for all the differences that we have in the world, hope is one of those common denominators. And so I tell that story a lot because then I tell it from the standpoint that in the middle of looking at leadership, sometimes leadership comes from the most unusual places. But it has the most effect on it. And I can assure you that there was never a time in any disaster plan that I've ever written that a wedding dress was on my list of supplies. But I can tell you now, I tell that story a lot because finding hope in disasters really seems to matter. The other is, do you know your community's health? We talked about that before. Can we anticipate? I always say the best surge capacity to have is don't have one, if you can avoid it. If we know that there is a significant primary care burden that can be disrupted by a flood, can we look to develop now an alternative to that primary care response? Can we use other facilities? Can we send those patients someplace else? Can we make sure that we're making the right decisions? And do we know how we report? And can we actually have good situational awareness? If we know that things are happening to us, can we be able to share what's happening with us with others so that we have response? And so in my couple of minutes relating on this, I want to just show you, this is a typical U.S. response structure, but don't look at it from the top down. Look at it from the bottom up, because that's really what we're doing in the U.S. now, is we're saying, how do we create resilience at the hospital level? And then how do we create resilience within the region between healthcare providers and healthcare providers? True disaster preparedness, true resilience begins at the grassroots level and then finds its way up, not coming from the top down necessarily. There's not a strong need for top down for saying the structures, but I'm a huge believer in community resilience. So here's what we developed in Alabama, because I thought it made sense. And so I designed this, and it's an incident management system. And what this incident management system does is it simply allows every hospital, every nursing home, every medical needs shelter to simply communicate with each other, to say, here's how we're doing during the event. So if you're at 90 ventilators, but you need a 91st one, you're able to say, I need another ventilator. In fact, I have a ventilator story. I wasn't going to tell this, but I'll tell this story anyway. We had a hurricane that had gone through. This isn't a Katrina story. This was a Hurricane Ike story. A hurricane that had gone through, and the number of patients that had pushed to one of our hospitals called USA Medical Center, it's one of our academic hospitals, had overstretched the number of ventilators. So we used this system, said, look, we need ventilators. And in fact, somebody at DCH Hospital, remember the picture of DCH from the tornadoes that I showed you? So somebody at DCH said, well, we have extra ventilators. Can you come get them? And I said, no, we can't come get them because we don't have any gas. We don't have, all of our gas stations are down, all the power's out. So the guy said, it's okay, I'll put them in my truck and I will drive them down, but I have a favor to ask. Now, this is a typical Alabama story, but it's a wonderful way to connect. I said, well, we can wait, but why can't you bring them down now? And he said, well, in the northern part of Alabama, this is the kickoff to high school football season, and my son's playing in his first game, and I don't want to miss his game. Is it okay if I get them down to you by midnight? So I suddenly realized that one of the rate limiting factors was whether or not, there was a football game, which is very important in Alabama. A football game going on. But the real benefit of Ames was the hospital was able to simply say, we need help. Another hospital was able to see that and be able to respond back. I don't know if you do that in Alabama now, and I'll just sort of zip through these, but one of my questions was, are you doing that now? And if you couldn't, it probably is fairly easy to do. You created sort of an advanced management system in which what you're really doing rationally is simply sharing really only two ultimate answers. I need help, I can help. Now, the what you need and the what you can do may be very different, but the fundamental questions around sharing situational awareness really are simply down to, we have too many patients, or we have too few supplies, we have too little food, we have too little water, we have too many patients requiring a ventilator, or we're able to take on more coronavirus patients, but I need staff to do that. Can I ship some of our other non-infectious patients to you, the hospitals that are more comfortable dealing with those patients? Can we rationalize that transport? It's all we're really trying to do. The real key to surge capacity management is your ability to recognize what you're capable of doing, to be able to recognize the barriers to that capability, and then to have the judgment to say either we need to move patients out or we need to ask for help coming in. And if you do that correctly, then you hit the fundamental point, and that is what? Maximizing the number of lives we can save. That's really what this is all about. But it's maximizing lives when circumstances around us have created an incredible amount of pressure on you as caregivers to deliver care in more difficult environments. And I'm actually right on time with that. I'm trainable, barely. And I wanted to leave time for questions and comments. So let's use that. We've created that time.
Let's put the lights on, please, so that we get questions now.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. We were thinking about decontamination. Actually, in the hospital we have a slot for decontamination, but for one casualty. But suppose there is mass incident casualty, we were thinking about that, and we were in a course also with the civil defense that we were discussing this. There was a suggestion that we will put the casualty in front of the hospital, emergency, and then we will bring a water tank, and then to let them, because also we were attending a real decontamination drill. It is a long procedure that candidates go through 3 stations and then get decontaminated and then to go to the hospital. What about if there were 50 casualties? Are they going to this procedure? Is it right that we will wash them by the tank?
Yes. No, that's a great question. So there's two points on that real quick.
for decontamination. One is that points out the fact that hospitals have to rely on community and other environments. That's point one. Secondly, that's actually a wonderful sort of test that you actually can do an exercise with, which is the throughput on decontamination. The first is, and we can talk about this maybe at some other point, is your own protection, how you're washing, what you're doing. Secondly is, do we care where the runoff goes? And the third is then, can we set something up, and is it okay just to have people coming through a water tank or a confined tent someplace? And the answer is yes. I mean, whatever you can do. Make sure that you include soap. It's not just water, as you know, right? So make sure you include soap as part of the decontamination process. And then it really is a question of throughput. And then if you've got enough water and enough throughput, but then also the question that you've got to ask is, do I care where that decontamination runoff goes? Does it simply run back out in the Red Sea? I'm okay with that. Do I care that it doesn't do that, or get into the water supply? And if so, then I've got to make some plans for the runoff piece. But yes, can you use that if you have to? The answer is yes. I would prefer that the water come in, but you've got some sort of a tent or something, so as people are coming through, right? There's a bit of an issue with that, of course, but okay. Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
It's here.
Yes, sorry?
Hi, thank you very much for your actually very thoughtful and comprehensive lecture. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you about the ethical manners. Because we are, as a doctor, physicians, healthcare providers, we face lots of ethical issues. And especially when it comes to disaster, there's going to be situations where we'll believe that not all of the patients are going to receive the treatments. So how do you think we should be prepared for such a thing?
That is a great question. And it's probably one of the most difficult ones in disasters. I would encourage you, and you probably already do a lot of this now, I would encourage you to include bioethical discussions as part of your disaster planning. I used an example a little bit earlier. If you had a limited number of ventilators, would you feel comfortable making a decision taking someone off a ventilator to use it on someone else that perhaps had a better likelihood of recovery? That's a very difficult question because triage is a difficult thing. There's so many ethical issues that come up in disasters. What if I have a limited amount of vaccine? What if I have a limited number of bed space? What if I have a limited number of medicines? What if I have a limited amount of food? And it's very, very interesting. And I'm going to give you an example that you can take with you. And if you want, be happy to share. This is going to seem strange, but if you know me well enough, occasionally things get a little unusual. And this is a longer answer, but I'm going to give you an example. If you've ever heard, there was a TV series called Star Trek. Anybody ever heard of Star Trek? Show of hands, thank you. So in Star Trek, perfect, you're seeing my great example. So in Star Trek, in order to get through the Starfleet Academy, you had to take a test, and the test was called the Kobayashi Maru. And so Kobayashi Maru is a stranded Starfleet vessel, starship, that's in Klingon territory. And so Klingon territory, they're the bad guys, right? It's in Klingon territory. And as a young Starfleet commander, you have to make a decision whether or not you're going to take your battleship and you're going to rush into Klingon territory and you're going to save this stranded ship with almost absolute certainty that you're going to be destroyed and that your mission is going to be unsuccessful. The only person that ever successfully passed that test, and he cheated, was who? Jim Kirk, right? Captain Kirk, the guy, the hero. The only guy that ever passed that. Now you're saying, why in the world would Carl use this example? In my classes, what I always taught, and what I would always ask you, and I'm going to leave you with this, is pretend for the moment that you are actually on that stranded freighter. And that you know that there is no hope of being saved. So now you have 300 people on this ship, and now all of a sudden you've got one of two choices. One choice is you take all the food and all the water and all the supplies that you have, and what do? Divide them equally, right? It's this wonderful sort of democratic response where we're all going to go together. Here's another choice. And that is, if you're a doctor, you're going to look and say, I have a limited number of supplies, I have a limited number of food, I have a limited number of resources. What if instead I take those and I take the crew members most likely to survive the longest, and they get all the supplies and all the food and all the resources, because that will prolong the chance that at least some will live, but I'm going to condemn others to death. But is that better than condemning everybody to death? Have that exercise, and that'll start to lead you to your answers. Thank you.
Very tough exercise.
Sorry, but I'm not going to talk about doctors and things like that. I'm talking about something else. Actually, how can I deal with decision takers when they believe freely that they are prepared for everything, for every crisis, every disaster? How can I deal with this one? Because some of the decision takers, they believe indeed we are prepared for everything. How can I deal with this? It's really difficult.
Yeah. How do you deal with the cost and the benefit?
No, I mean, they believe inside, deeply, they are prepared for everything. Now tell them that, no, you should do so and so, and say, no, we are prepared. We don't need your thinking, whatever you say. So how can I deal with these people? This taking and close.
That's an interesting challenge. Oops, sorry. All right, I'm poorly trained. You know, there are multiple parts of your question, aren't there? I mean, part of it is, how do you deal with preparedness, but then deal with the output of what happens, right? And how do you deal with the grieving in society? How do you deal with what happens? I'm prepared. I've responded, but events have still overtaken us, right? Is that sort of implied in your... You know, I'm going to give you an example, and it's not a good answer to your question. But I'm going to tell you there are 3 stages during a disaster. 3 stages here. The first stage is one of having to deal with the anger and frustration, right? How could this happen to me? Why is it my home that flooded? Why is it and surely you must have heard this during the floods, right? Why is it our area? Why is it our region? Why was it our neighborhood? How come somebody didn't do something for us, right? So the first stage of that is always frustration. And it's going to blame, by the way, it's going to blame the planners. It's going to blame the government. It's going to blame others. You know, it's you didn't. You know, you built where you shouldn't have built. You know, you didn't have the proper sewage or proper drain where you should have drained. So the first stage of having to deal with, the very first stage, and you'll have to see it. Believe me, you will have patients that will walk in a disaster that you think, I'm here to save you. And they're mad. And they're angry. And what they're angry at is they're angry at their circumstances. So the first issue is dealing with anger. The second thing that happens is very interesting. The second phase is acceptance, right? So you're angry, but then the second thing that happens is acceptance. But I'll share with you, acceptance of the event can be very short term. Because then what happens is life is not static. And so where you think, oh, it's okay, it just, you know, it happened, it was an event. But then, because recovery is uneven, and this is very important for governments, very important for governments. Recovery is uneven. Then the question is, why are they getting theirs first? Why are their houses fixed first? Why is their power on first? I was with some wonderful friends in Palestine telling about snowstorms 2 years ago. And they got their power on last. After everybody else had gotten their power on, their power came on last. And so the question was, why did our power come on last? So you go from acceptance back to where? Back to anger. And back to frustration, because recovery is uneven. You know, why did that neighborhood get their power turned on first? So you've got to deal with grief, but you've also got to deal with the phases of grief, and you've got to deal with your young people. I mean, say, you know, this shouldn't have happened or couldn't have happened. Well, it's not just the young. Anybody that's impacted by the event will go through that same process, and it will impact you. I'm not in charge of questions. That's
I'll try to distribute fairly between up and down.
One up there? Okay.
Okay, ladies, then we'll start with ladies, then you are. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, it still didn't come on. I can sort of hear you, though. That's okay. Oh, there you go.
Okay, good. Thank you for, first of all, for the great lecture and the great information we had. I had a bit sensitive question. How would you deal with resistance? You might face people who are resisting the idea that something wrong can happen to us. So they won't plan for it because they don't believe that it will happen to us. As you said before, this will never happen to us. So how can we deal with such a sensitive topic, especially if resistance came from positions of people in the leadership? So I don't know what to do in this case.
That's a great question also.
Thank you.
So the question, if you heard, it's a great question. How do you deal with resistance, right? I'm going to give you a terrible answer, and then I'm going to give you a slightly longer one. The terrible answer that you can take with you is a Carlism, which is save the willing first. And then I'm going to give you a longer answer. One of the issues that you have in imagination and challenges is if you believe something won't happen, can't happen here, is I'm a big believer in using visualizations. If you remember the slide that I used in my first talk, right? If you can create a picture of an event, or if you can share an experience from someone else that has gone through an event, even if they're from somewhere else, then you can begin at least for people, you know, we get tied into our mental memes, right? So we believe that every storm is going to look like the last storm because that's what happened to us. And then all of a sudden, you know, something happens that's worse that we didn't expect. And in many cases, that becomes our next storm, but the next one's easier, right? So we get locked into these mental pictures. The mental pictures are always the last event, not the next event that happened to us. So I'm a huge believer in using visualizations and models and images so that people can imagine the challenges that occur. And then you're always going to have some people that just say, I'm not leaving my home. I'm not going to abandon. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going to prepare. You know, at some point you just have to say, okay, you know, that's, you know, I gave a talk this past week on dealing with the problems of elderly patients in the U.S. And and what I said to the audience, they were very, very, very experienced caregivers for seniors. And I said, don't deal with the seniors. Deal with their children. Because the seniors have so many things that are so locked in their mind of what's right or wrong, and in many cases not correct. I said, but deal with their children, because the children will begin to make decisions for them. And so it may be that what you start to look for is look for community leaders that have influence. Look for people who will be those leaders that people turn to. Look for what I call positive deviance. You know, even in the most difficult of circumstances, you find people that survive and thrive, and what you look at is you say, those are the models I want to know about. A lot of times we always look at the negatives, right? We look at the number of people that starve and, you know, in camps or in difficult times. Look at some of the people who are really doing well and say, how do I share that lesson? How do I share that lesson? And do I use text messaging? Do I use some sort of visualization or storytelling? Do I use some sort of modeling? But can I begin to share that and then tie it to experiences of others that could also potentially happen here? Tell a story. Tell a story.
Okay, we have two final questions.
Okay.
This one and then the Jimmy.
Yes, Mr. Tyler, thank you for the reflections. Can I make contribution to the last two questions? Just to convince the higher authorities or decision makers that we need to improve in our preparedness, that we make a drill. A drill, it will show whether we are how much prepared for any crisis or any incident. This is just my contribution. My question, if you go back to the slide of Alabama Incident Management System, you have changed after the crisis. How it was before and then how it was after you improve it. I mean, after the incident.
Oh, do we have another hour? Yeah, I know. All right, I know. Never mind, you have things to do. I'm going to try and give you a short answer, but you've tied into a huge issue, and that is the command system's running after an event occurs. Here's what's really important if you're going to develop something. Find a reason to make it useful when the sun is out, when a disaster is not occurring, if you can. Because that's when systems, you learn, you remember, you use it, and you share it. The other thing is that the incident management system, which is sharing resources between hospitals, you've got to build those relationships beforehand, right? The incident management system is simply recording data that comes in from hospitals during an event. The relationships are built before the event occurs. I'm always a believer in saying that when a disaster occurs, if you're then just building your hastily formed networks, you're way too late. You've missed the opportunity. So what needs to happen today is begin to build those relationships. Begin to build those capabilities. Begin to build that, how do you want to connect with me? How do you want us to share information? And do it today. And maybe what you can do is find something that's kind of small, but meaningful. So one of the things that we've experimented with is, well, what about trauma care? Or what about auto accidents? Or what about cardiac care? What about oncology? Can we just, let's take something that we do really well and begin to share that with other hospitals. Managing coronavirus is a great example. Can we begin that relationship and let them share things back that they're doing well and begin to build so that then when an event occurs, that sharing relationship already exists. And so whatever those barriers were to that relationship will change. When I first put AIMS together, it was a downloadable software, and we realized we had met the enemy, which was the chief information officer of the hospitals, who said, that's not running in here. So we converted it to web-based, because I didn't want to fight with that. And the reason we did it that way was I wanted the human interaction, right? AIMS is an expression in technology format, but of humans communicating with each other. All I wanted to do was find the ability to get humans to communicate. Much better to start that process now than to try and find somebody after an event's occurred and wonder whether or not they're working or what their capabilities are, because then you don't even know how to reach them, right? So start now and find a daily use. Use oncology, use cardiac, use trauma.
Final question?
I remember you're up to no, actually, if we can get this one and then one more. I'll be quicker with my answers.
First, I want to thank
You're
you.
asking really great questions.
First, I want to thank you for the outstanding lectures today. I really enjoyed the topics, and I think we're very fortunate to have such a guy with, I think, more than 20 or 30 years experience in the field.
You've noticed I'm old, right? Yeah, thank you for that.
You've
I was
mentioned
having a great time until then, but it's okay.
You've mentioned many great things about preparedness, disaster management, and surge management. However, I want to view it from a different perspective. Doing all these stuff really requires good teams, prepared teams. So I just want your view for what happens behind the scenes. What's your advice for us to develop really good teams so we can be well prepared for any disasters?
That's a great, how much more time do I have? Yeah, that's not fair. I just want you to know it's not fair. You're my friend, but it's not fair. So what we use in the United States, it's not perfect, but we use something called an incident command structure. And it's like forming an organizational chart, but for disasters. And what you try and do within that chart is you identify what are the things that we're going to need to respond to disasters. And then you pick leaders for those teams. Those teams then build their teams, and they fit into a structure. And the reason why that's important is, one of the common goals of the ICS structure is to create common language. I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago with a lovely young researcher, a guy from Germany. And he was talking about how many different symbols just for ambulances they have in Europe, and nobody uses the same symbol. And I thought, well, that's your first problem. Come up with a common language. So incident command structure is really a common language. So let's use logistics. Let's use let's so that when we're asking for something, we understand what it is we're asking for. So look to develop what I'll call an organizational chart for disaster response. It doesn't have to mirror your organizational chart for actually running the hospital. In many cases, it won't, because maybe whoever's at the top is going to be responding to community things or off doing something else. But if you develop that sort of structure, that allows you to name the kinds of teams that you need. Then it allows you to start to assign people into those teams, both with leaders, with people that will take their place if they're not working or if they're out ill, and then they build out the teams underneath them. So I would develop something that looked like an incident command structure and use that as a place to start. And there was one more up there.
Go ahead.
Or two more. Or one more. One more. One more. Only time for one more. Okay.
Thank you again for the great discussion. I would like just to ask you about the sharing the health information system between the institute, between the hospitals, between all the health networks. Often, actually, the planning, the planning process and preparedness for the disaster management is kind of maintained within secrecy. I don't know actually to what extent we should actually share these informations between and how much is it important for us to share it between the healthcare institutes?
That's a great question too. So again, I'm going to give you a short answer to an all-day topic. There's two ways to share information, and so let me start with the first one. I believe at the very least, you should be using de-identified data today for a couple of reasons. One is to be able to determine your community's burden of illness, right? And I'm back to this, if we know that our community, and in fact we begin to spotlight certain geographic areas of our community, have a particular exposure to respiratory illnesses, then we know if a sandstorm's coming in, we know where we're going to deploy information out to that community. We know where that burden is. You can use it for planning purposes. And so what I'd like to do, if possible, is always predict who's going to come through my door. Now, I probably can't predict the trauma side, but I can certainly predict the displaced primary care patients that may come to see us in the event of a large emergency. That prediction comes from de-identified patient care. My second, and this is a wish list, and perhaps you've already done it, but I think it's important, is if there's an ability also when a patient presents themselves. Remember, in many cases, the patient is displaced because of the reason of the disaster, but if they are presenting themselves to the emergency room at the hospital here, the more information you can know about that patient, perhaps not for trauma necessarily, but the more information you know about that patient, the more effective you can be in care. I was in Montana a few weeks ago setting up remote emergency rooms back to large emergency rooms, mostly Native American reservations and small hospitals. And there was a lady who was actually there, and she showed up in one of the emergency rooms, pulled up her smartphone, clicked into her patient record at the Mayo Clinic and said, this is me, these are my drugs, these are my known conditions, this is my problem. She'd had previous heart surgery. And it made it so much more effective to be able to deliver care because of that known information. So use de-identified information for planning purposes, but if there's a way rationally to be able to share information during the event so you know more about the patients that are coming in, then I think that's great. My only other final caveat is that presumes that your access to electronic medical records stay up, because when the power goes back off, you're going to be back to paper and doing the best you can. Okay?
With that, I'd like, to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Taylor. And it's an honor for us to have you with us here at the University Hospital. I'd like to thank you again on behalf of all the audience here, and I'd like to thank you for staying until this time, to stay till the end of the presentation, and the discussion was fruitful, was outstanding, and we look forward to all of us to attend for the second workshop, which is going to be on Thursday. Tomorrow, yeah, of course, tomorrow, but the other one was, yeah. So that would like to invite everybody to come for the tomorrow and after tomorrow. And thank you again very much indeed for all the discussions. Thank you very much.